We're working on Chapter 6. Chapter 6 furthers our work with active record. But in this case, we're going to be doing things more than just the defaults that that Rails does for us. One thing that we're going to begin with is we're going to begin by taking some of the default methods that are created anytime that we create a model, and we're going to add methods to it to kind of enhance what it does, and we're going to maybe ramp up our validation process just a little bit. And this process of adding methods to classes is what they often refer to as domain logic, basically. And really what's going to happen here is we'll have commands like this. So for example, remember that file that we were looking at, and in fact if we were just working on the Chapter 5 video, I happen to keep this file open, and you can see that the code in here basically is an equivalent of these two lines. Now it's expressed a little bit differently. What they're doing is they have a comma here, so I'm allowed to basically have the one command but have it affect two different columns in the model. But that is in essence the same code. But then you can see here that they're making a little bit of an adjustment, and that adjustment is that they're adding a method. You know it's a method because they put that little def in front of it. That just means they're defining a method. And then I'm going to make sure I follow the convention of 2 spaces for an indent. But if you're thinking about what that is, we're basically creating something called long_title, and then inside of there as a string, that kind of looks like a hash, doesn't it? It's got title and published at. Now, what this really is doing, if you think about it, is it's taking those two components and it's basically combining them together so that if I output just that method, so if I use that method, it's going to give me both the title and the published at. So you can kind of see the byproduct of it. So I've made the change to this file, so I'm going to go ahead and just Control S to save it. And then as the book indicates, we should get back into the console. So let's type Rails console. And then it wants us to issue this command. So let's go ahead and create an article. Part of the reason they're doing this is because they're not sure what we destroyed in our previous work. And then once again, we're going to also go through the trouble here of getting everything onto one line. So it's only one line number, not two. And then I'm going to take all that and paste it to the prompt. Alright, so what that's doing is it's creating an article with the title of Advanced Active Record, the published at, taking today's timestamp, and then it also provides a body for the article, and then it should indicate what it's doing, gives you the SQL commands, and then it indicates when it's all done that it did create it, and here's the output, and that's what got stored. Now if I run the command that we just created, or the method that we just created, we're using this syntax here. So we're pulling up from the model the last article, and then we're running the method long title. And when we do that, it grabs the title of the article, just like we declared, puts in a dash, because this is all a string in essence, and then gives me the timestamp that was created when we did the create article command. So you see, basically what we did is we took that class file, so class article, we added a method to it, very simple one. We created a new article, and then we ran that method, and it gave us exactly what it was intended to. So basically what you learned here is that if you understand that you can create something, type in a command like this, article.last.long title, and this is something that we generated. It's not one of the built-in methods. And the other thing that you're going to see here, and this is a convention that's going to continue as we're working, is when you're creating your own methods, the real strong recommendation is that you create them with very verbose language. And the reason for that is because this language has so many built-in methods that might use common words, you want to be careful. So like, I might even have chosen to say display long title. You know, make it very descriptive. And that way you do not interfere with all the defaults that already exist. All right, I'm going to move on to the next section here where we start to talk about associations. Now, when we talk about associations, you think in terms of databases, and if you guys learned like I did, you probably didn't learn the word association to replace the word relationship within regular database work. And that is really what is going on here. So when we form any sort of a relation or association, really what we're doing is we're finding a way to tie together various tables. So for example, this little diagram here shows us the table that we've already been working with, articles. And in articles, the primary key is the ID field. So that's the one that has to be unique, and it identifies each record. Now, if we were to create a separate table or model, if you will, that might allow us to create comments on articles, and that's actually pretty common in a blog, right? Somebody writes a blog, and then people that are users of the system can log in and then add comments to an article. So if we have one article, it's possible that we might have many comments for it, right? So the way that we would attribute the comment would be through the relationship between the primary key of ID in this table and then the basically what is a foreign key in the comments table. So comments needs to have some sort of a link to an article in order to even be able to exist. It has its own ID for its own sake, but it's that link that drives it. Now, because this is that foreign key relationship, it is going to be a one-to-many relationship. It can't be many-to-many, for example. All right. So that is kind of the rule of thumb here. That is, if you start to forge a relationship from one type of table to another, built upon this whole MVC architecture, so we'll have our model. Remember, the model is kind of like the class file that represents the table of data that it works with. All right, so here the model is article, the table that holds the information is articles, and then if we are to make a relationship, a foreign key relationship to that table, we basically use the table name in the singular with an underscore and ID. And once again, they kind of show you all those weird nuances, like if the model is person, the table is people, but the foreign key is person because that's the singular of people. All right, that's kind of an odd one, and I probably would avoid it just because of that. But most of them, I think, are pretty intuitive. That, like, you know, the plural and singular approach applies to this as well. So be careful what you name things, and then remember what the actual plurals of common words are, because that's what they'll use inside of this programming language. Now what's kind of neat is when you're actually going to forge these connections between these different data models, there's a number of different things that we have available to us in this programming structure that makes our life a lot easier. Some of the stuff that's going to happen, though, is we have to understand like those database paradigms. All of you have had database, so I have, pretty good confidence that if I say one-to-many or many-to-many, you get what it is, right? So now, in this language, they have a different approach to saying the same thing. So notice here, they have a thing that says has one, has many, has and belongs to many, belongs to. Those are not exactly the terminologies that we're used to. Now, the ultimate byproduct of like making the associations will be some syntactic ease, basically, once the associations are formed. So, for example, if I load up an article, and that article has comments that's associated with it by virtue of the associations that we're about to form, you can then just very simply say article.comments, and if that article is loaded into memory, you know that it's pulling in those things automatically just because there's a connection between the data. So that's pretty darn cool. Once that's formed, you can then leverage that, and you can actually even start switching the position of these words, and it still works. And that's kind of the fun part of it. All right, take a look at the usage for some of these declarations here. So here they're talking about these 4 different ones, and they're trying to give an example of a scenario. So here they're saying that we might have a model called message. And a message, think of like email, is a singular thing. However, you could attach multiple files to it. So the logic there is has many. So really what it's doing is it's saying one-to-many relationship, one message to many. So that's their way of saying one-to-many. Now when we switch our position here, and then we go to and look at the model for attachment. So in other words, the attachment has its own data structure, that will contain the file or what other information might go with it, but it understands that it belongs to message, meaning the connection is formed from here, from attachment to message, by virtue of that command. The type of relationship that it is going to be dictated by what's inside of message, that it recognizes that it's related to attachments. And notice plural, lowercase, singular, uppercase. But it belongs to message and has many attachments. So it's one to many. This is how you declare that whole association. Now, if you get that concept of foreign key from your database class, it's not really that bad. Now they're going to ramp it up a little bit, and they're going to start talking about one-to-one associations. Now, we're going to use basically the same type of approach, and I'm sorry for jumping back and forth, but the technique here is basically going to be one like this. Instead of has many and belongs to, it's going to be has one and belongs to. The belongs to is going to be required. The has one and the has many is really what the difference is. All right, so the thing that we're going to do here to be able to demonstrate this stuff is we are going to need to generate a new model. Now, the reason for that is, and I still have my SQLite browser up and running here, is this is our database right now in all the tables. You'll see that there's a schema table, an internal metadata. Obviously, those aren't things that we created, and there's also this little SQLite component. Those are auto-generated components that basically allow the database to function. The only thing that we created was articles. Now, if we're going to form relationships between different tables or models, we have to have other models to work with. So that's why we're doing that. So let's go ahead and get to a prompt and type in this command. Now, here I'm still at an interactive Ruby prompt. question is this where I want to be? I was kind of hoping for a definitive, this is the answer. You guys are very quiet. No, we want to get out of the interactive Ruby prompt. We want to go to a standard prompt. Whenever we see this $ prompt, that indicates a standard Unix or Linux command prompt. So we need to exit out of that Ruby interactive prompt console. So to do that, I just typed exit. Now we should be able to paste in that command. And notice what this is going to do. It's going to generate a model named user. We're also, right off the bat, declaring a field called string, or excuse me, email, that's a string, and password, that's a string. So let's go ahead and press enter. We'll let Ruby and Rails do their work in the background. And then as a successful result of the command, you can see that it invoked Active Record. That's the tool that makes all this work. It added something to the database migration folder, and that is a Ruby file that allows us to create users. In the app models folder, it created a user Ruby file. And that's the file that actually would be one where we could add our own methods to, for example. And then it also set up test files for it too when we get to doing test-driven development. Those are components that we would utilize. So if we were successful, we should be able to come up here now, hopefully, and maybe I'm thinking that, you know why it's not there? And this is kind of where our demonstration is leading us, because I'm looking for this table that's supposedly created and I don't see it. I'm looking in the database structure and I don't see it. But remember with Rails and Ruby and this MVC architecture, what happens is you can generate the model, but the model is a code representation of what will eventually be created in the database. In order to actually create it in the database, we have to run a database migration that will then build it into the database, and that's kind of the different thing here, basically. I'm going to come out of full screen again with this. And then we're also going to need to go in and adjust the file. So this file that was just created in the migrate folder, the one that's called create users, we're going to go in there and let's go take a look at that file. So if you want to navigate through your file system here, this is under database, migrate, and create users. That's the Ruby file we just created with the generate command. Let's go ahead and open that up and take a look, and you'll see that it does match what's indicated here. So now what this is saying is that when it comes time to run that migration, that command will come to this file. It will look for create users. It will then find this method and execute it. And what that method does is it creates a table, users, and then it goes through and instantiates as strings these two columns. And then notice that it also has a thing for timestamps, and the timestamps basically are those two little parts in the database that we're seeing even with the articles, where even though we created a published at date column, automatically the database keeps a column that says when this was created, this record was created, and when it was updated last. And those are done by virtue of that command. That command was put in there automatically. These two were not. These were created by virtue of typing that generate command. So the interesting thing about that is if you know in advance the stuff that you want to put into a model, you can do it and you can just say, well, I need a model called user and I need an email and a password and they're both strings. Boom, I'm done. I have it. The model is built. But you could also come in here and add stuff to it manually. I mean, you see the syntax. The syntax isn't hard. So if I wanted to maybe have some like descriptive text or something like that, I could manually add it to the file here, and then when the database migration would run, it would build out that particular table. All right, so now they're kind of going through this whole rationale here of, all right, we created basically a model for users, so we're going to create a table for users, and that's going to store their email address and their password. All right, and that sounds pretty reasonable. A lot of places you go to when you create an account, your email address is your username, and one of the reasons that strategy is used is basically email accounts need to be unique on any server that they're on, right? And if they're unique on that server and you use the whole email address, then they're typically going to be a very unique username. So that's kind of a thinking there. But they're thinking that if we have something for users, so a table of users with their logins and passwords, it might also be helpful that those users might be able to have a profile. So each user might store information about themselves, like their name, their avatar, perhaps, personal info. So what they're going to have us do now is create another model, and I don't know if this one will paste cleanly or not. Nope, it looks like it cut off. Oh. Yeah, and you see what I did here too is I ran it, and it only ran part way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have that command copied. I'm going to go back to Notepad++ here, once again using it as a copy-paste buffer. And I'm going to type this back in. Now, here's the problem. I've already typed it in and it already did some of the work, right? The question is, what work did it do, and will I break anything? This is actually a really good example. Will I break anything by running the command again, complete? There's only one way to find out. Let's paste it. Now I got the whole string in there. And let's see if it throws back any information. And it does. It says conflict. Create profiles. Already named create profiles. Use force to replace this migration or skip to ignore conflicted file. So what do you think I should do? Force maybe? Right? I mean, it's telling you very explicitly how to fix it, and I do want this corrected version to be the one, so I'm just going to do a force. Alright, so you can see as part of the process, it did remove the pre-existing one, and it created a new one. And once again, as with the previous file, it's not a bad idea to go take a look. Now, I know that there's a command coming up that we're going to run that you guys probably, I'm sure, can't wait to look at. But what I want to do right now is just take a look at that Ruby file that we just created, just so you can see the parallels. So you can see from the commands that we typed. So it's called profile, and then notice the migration's called create profiles plural, and then it creates a table. It's got user ID, name, birthday, etc. So all of these match up. Once again, timestamps is automatically in there. So I think you're getting to see the pattern here. Now, none of this stuff is actually built. Generating the model does not build the table. It just helps us build the tool to build the table. That's really what it's doing for us. It does not actually get built until we do this command, which is rake db migrate. And that's one that you'll get to know pretty well, because what will happen is when you're working from the command line like this, or if you're working directly with the files where the migrations happen, you'll make changes and then you'll run your application expecting those changes to have stuck, but the truth is they won't stick until you run the migration to rebuild the data components. And then in many cases, sometimes you have to also stop and start your server. It just kind of depends on what particular actions are happening. All right, so here's the rake db migrate, and we'll let the command execute. All right, so you can see what it did. It went into that folder where all the migrations are listed, and it goes through one by one, create users, it's migrating, creates it, it's all done, creates profiles, migrating, does it, it's all done. Now the question is, all right, I understand that we just added users and profiles, no wonder it created it, so why didn't it do these? Because it didn't need to. It was intelligent enough to realize there's no changes, so since there's no changes, I won't run those. But if I were to change those, make any changes to any of these, and then I would run that rake db migrate, it would once again rebuild all those data models and actually build out the components in the database. Now the one way that we can check that, of course, is we can bring up this tool, and I'm just going to run a refresh here, and if I'm right, and I am, because that was my plan, you can see that the database structure now includes these new tables. All right, basically proving to you that the migration actually worked. All right, so at this point what we're going to start doing is we're going to start looking at some of these model files that are generated. So just to kind of ramp this up another level here, if you go into the root folder, go to app, go to models, you're going to see that for each one of the tables that we created, we have a Ruby file that matches. So these are the actual models. The other things are the migrations. Those are the things that build the models. So if I actually go in, and I'm not sure if they're showing you all of these tables here, but I assume they're showing you user and profile. We'll just take a quick look at each one of those. Just open them up in Notepad++, and you'll see that they are, in essence, empty, right? The reason that they're empty is we haven't put anything in there, but we certainly can. And the one thing that we're going to do is we're going to use this syntax. We're going to say has one, we're going to add it to the user file, and then in the profile file we're going to put in the belongs to, 2 spaces for an indent, and we'll make sure that we save each one of those. So now remember what we did here, like we were talking about earlier, is that user is not going to have many profiles. He's going to have, every user is going to have one profile. So what we're forging here is a one-to-one relationship with profile, and with profile it throws in this belongs to user, and by virtue of having those two things, there's going to be a foreign key relationship built by adding those 2 lines of code here. So remember that that's the thing that we're doing. Now they have a little graphic here that kind of demonstrates that, and I think I'm hoping at this point you understand that concept. The profiles table has its own ID, so we can't link off of that because every table's got an ID field, but I can link to the user's ID field using user_ID. It's a one-to-one relationship. User has one profile. Profile belongs to user. Just to kind of reiterate the syntax that's going there. All right, so one thing that they want us to do now, and that is if you already have a console session running, you guys might still have your Ruby prompt going from before, I'm not sure. If not, you're going to want to load up the Rails console. But if you did have it open, they're basically saying that you could just run the reload command and it would go. Now what I'm going to do here is I do have my prompt that I've been working with. And I'm just going to type Rails console, get that prompt going. If you want to type reload just to see what it does, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to issue a couple of commands. So now remember, the reason that we come down to the Ruby prompt is it allows us to basically write code on the fly and have it interact with our application. It's kind of like a shortcut way to do some work. So in this case, we're going to type this command. We're going to be setting up a temporary variable. I'm going to expand this here. And we're going to be pasting in this command. It says user equals user, and remember that's going to tie in with the model, and we're going to run the method called create, and what that's going to do is it's going to create in the email field an email that's going to be the user's username, and the password, which of course is very secret, and it's secret. It's all inside of parentheses. And I'm going to go ahead and press enter to execute the command, and you see the SQL statements being generated and executed. So now we do have user in the user table. We can go ahead and bring up our SQLite browser here, and I'm hoping at this point it should pull up the information that we just generated. Pretty simple, really. So hopefully you're starting to get kind of the swing of how that's working, I'm hoping. All right, yeah, let's change things up and we'll put them on opposite sides of the screen. All right, next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a profile in very much the same way. This one I see is split over 2 lines. I'm just going to play it safe here. Combine those lines in advance. Very much the same technique. Setting up a variable called profile. We're going to build off the profile model, running the create method, and then each one of the fields is getting a string of text. Press enter. All right, and then this one's throwing back a little bit of an error, I think. All right, you can see, or maybe it's not really a error, because the name is John Doe. The bio is Ruby developer trying to learn Rails. All right, so I do see that the John Doe made it in there. I do see that the bio made it in there. But everything else is nil. Now the question is, why? Well, let me answer that for you. Now remember, we just forged an association, right, between the tables. In order to have a profile must be attributed to a user, because the profile belongs to the user, and the user has one profile. So really what's happening, and I'm guessing that the book is going to indicate this next, and you can see it basically did the same thing. Oh, except no, we didn't get the updated or created at, so it actually didn't even commit it, did it? So part of it seems, got rejected. Let's just take a look at the database here. See if profiles has anything in there. It doesn't. I'm doing the refresh just to make sure. So I wonder if we have some sort of a mistake in the code that we pasted. And if that's the case, maybe you guys can help me find it. Alright, so I'm actually just going to kind of leave that alone. I don't think it actually wrote to the database as it should have. You know, I'm going to up arrow and just double check this really quick, just to make sure that that code was correctly copy pasted. Not that one, we want this one. Yeah, it doesn't seem to want to do it, and I'm trying to figure out why. What I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to type this out longhand, because I have some concerns about how it's pasting. This is just basically a problem-solving approach here. Did you guys get this one to work? Okay, so it's not just me. That's good.
I'm having trouble in the beginning, so.
Well, one step at a time. Yeah, it's not liking that for some reason. Alright, let's take a second to try to figure that out. Alright, as we're trying to troubleshoot this, we were also kind of noticing that the files that we were working at did not have this little piece at the end. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy that into our files. Not necessarily sure that this is going to fix our problem, but you know, it doesn't hurt to try. Make sure both of those are saved. Now I went through the process of reloading the variables, so I should be able to type in that same command again, and with any luck it's still here. I'm crossing our fingers. Alright, at least now we're getting an error message. Yeah, so it's not liking that. So apparently that's not going to be our fix. So I am going to remove this. Now, I'm going to try one other little trick here. And what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to bring up a separate prompt. and I'm in my application. I'm going to run a database migration here because I just have this sneaking suspicion that this might fix our problem. So I'm going to go ahead and do the migrate. And we'll let it do its work. And if nothing changed, we'll get an indication like this, right? Nothing changed. If something did change, that would have built it out for us so that whatever we did would work. So hypothetically, if we did have a problem, that way it would have been fixed. Alright, so doing a little troubleshooting here. I'm trying to figure out exactly what's going on, and I've tried a couple different techniques, none of which seem to work. But it was pretty clear that at some point when I was running these commands, it was actually pulling back the fact that John Doe and then that Ruby developer part were getting stored in there. And then when I ran the subsequent command, user.profile, which is the one that actually tests to see that the link is made, it did spit back nil as it was supposed to, because sure enough the association wasn't there. I then went ahead and entered this command, which you can see, and then that actually went ahead and did the transaction. Now what's interesting about that is here that just created the hash, and then in order to actually store that, you have to do user.save, which I haven't done yet, but what I'm thinking is going on is that an adjustment in the languages happened, because remember we're working with version 5, this is version 4, that may have wrapped all that stuff in together. Now I'm going to type this next command, which is user save, and see if that runs, and it looks like it's running just fine. Now once again I'm going to do user.profile, and now what you're seeing here, and I'm hoping you're able to decipher this, is user.profile is now linking those two together. So even though we were getting some sort of a weird error message, it actually did work. So what we thought was a failure was actually a success. It's just the way that the language has evolved. So actually it's kind of a relief, honestly. But what it shows you is that user.profile now, look at what it's doing inside here. It says profile ID1, user ID1, so it links back to user 1. It pulls back the name, the birth date is null, the bio, which we entered in there. It did have the created at and the update at inside there. Now there's a couple of additional commands that follow that we should probably try to execute before we adjourn for the evening. And that would be, let's try this command here, and I'll paste it in and we can talk our way through it. So it says user create underscore profile. That's kind of interesting because we didn't create any methods called that, but it has a built-in create, which is part of profile, and I remember that from the text file. And then we're going to have a name of Jane Doe and a color of pink. So I'm going to go ahead and execute. And you can see it went through a whole little series of commands here. I'm trying to find like the actual typing of the command. Okay, the command was right here. It's off screen a little bit, but it is there. And it went ahead and created that, and you can see the information that got stored in there. Now, if you press on to the bottom of that next page, you can see that there's a bunch of different methods that we can leverage once we have this association going. So take a look at this one that we already typed in, and this is the most basic form of it. It says it returns the associated profile object with a particular user. Otherwise, you have these other ones that you can leverage. Now, we are at the point where we're a good 5 minutes past 10 p.m., and I know you guys want to go home. So I think we're going to stop right here, and we'll pick up when we come back. Once these associations are formed, we can keep using them. The worst case scenario of what will happen here is we might have to retype some commands next time we come back. If you want to keep on working on this chapter on your own, I do have all my old videos out there that basically walk through the same materials with similar explanations, maybe running into different sets of problems. But either way, it does get you through the material. So if you want to press forward and work on your homework, you do have some resources there to work with. Otherwise, when we return next week, we'll jump right back in where we are here. And you can see how these active record chapters are some of the more challenging ones in the book in a number of different ways. But once we clear this hurdle, then we start moving into controllers and helper methods and things like that, which I think you'll find kind of interesting. All right, that ends this video for tonight. We'll see you next week.